A stranger offered her a seat in his wagon just minutes after another family left her standing alone at the train station. But what he quietly carried back to his ranch would soon test far more than either of them expected. A wagon wheel slammed into a rut, throwing her worn suitcase against the wooden rail. The train whistle faded behind them while dust swirled across the road. The little boy beside her clutched a tin water flask, and the silent cowboy never looked back at the station. Then a rider appeared far ahead, waiting where the trail narrowed. "Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and come along for this unforgettable journey." The afternoon train groaned to a stop beneath a sky washed pale by late September dust. Steam drifted over the platform at Ash Creek Depot, carrying the smell of coal, hot iron, and dry sagebrush. Travelers stepped down one after another, greeting waiting relatives with handshakes and laughter. Within minutes, wagons rolled away, leaving the station quieter than before. Ivy Carter stepped onto the wooden platform with one worn leather suitcase and a folded envelope tucked inside her coat pocket. The hem of her dark blue traveling dress was stained with dust from 2 days on the train. She smoothed it with her hand anyway. Old habits were hard to lose. She spotted a couple standing beside a polished wagon. The man held the same letter she had received weeks earlier, inviting her to Montana as a tutor for their children. Ivy smiled politely and walked toward them. "I'm Ivy Carter," she said. "Thank you for meeting me." The woman glanced at her husband. Neither reached for Ivy's suitcase. For several quiet seconds, only the whistle of the departing train filled the air. "I'm sorry," the man finally said, without looking directly at her. "We've decided to make other arrangements." Ivy blinked once. "I came all the way from Kansas." "I know. The letters. They were written before." His voice faded. He adjusted the reins in his hands instead. His wife offered a thin, uncomfortable smile. "We wish you well." Nothing more. They climbed into their wagon and drove away, wheels rattling over the hard-packed road until even the dust settled behind them. Ivy remained standing beside the depot. Around her, doors closed. The station porter carried empty trunks inside. A pair of ranch hands laughed as they loaded sacks of flour into another wagon. Nobody seemed to notice the woman still holding a suitcase with nowhere to go. She sat on a wooden bench beneath the station awning. The envelope in her pocket suddenly felt heavier than the suitcase at her feet. She unfolded it once more. The careful handwriting promised honest work, kind children, and a place to stay through winter. The words hadn't changed. Only the people had. A cool breeze swept across the valley, carrying the scent of pine from distant hills. Ivy quietly folded the letter again. She wasn't angry, just tired. Very tired. At the opposite end of the platform, another wagon arrived. A tall man climbed down first. His brown hat had seen years of weather. His coat carried fresh dust from the trail, and the leather gloves tucked into his belt showed careful repairs instead of expensive replacements. 2 children jumped from the wagon before he could stop them. A little boy raced toward a stack of supply crates. A girl, older by several years, walked behind him with slower, measured steps. "Stay where I can see you, Ben," the man called. "I am." "You ain't." The boy laughed anyway. Inside the freight office, the station clerk handed the man several parcels wrapped in brown paper. "Coffee, nails, horse liniment, and that school slate your daughter asked for." The man thanked him with a quiet nod. While he counted receipts, Ben wandered across the platform. He noticed Ivy sitting alone. Children often saw things adults pretended not to. He walked over carrying a small tin water flask. "My pa says traveling makes people thirsty." Without waiting for permission, he offered it. Ivy hesitated, then accepted it with both hands. "Thank you." "You're welcome." She took one careful sip before handing it back. "You must be Ben." His eyes widened. "How'd you know?" She smiled faintly. "I heard your father call your name." Ben grinned. I thought maybe you were a teacher. What made you think that? You talk like one. Before Ivy could answer, heavy boots crossed the platform. Caleb Sutton stopped beside them. He looked first at his son, then at the stranger with the worn suitcase. He noticed the folded employment letter sticking halfway from her coat pocket. He noticed there was no wagon waiting nearby. He noticed everything. Without asking questions, he simply said, "Ma'am." She stood. "I'm sorry," she replied quietly. "We'll be out of your way." He studied her face for a brief moment. Not with suspicion, not with pity, only careful attention. Ben looked up at his father. "She was thirsty. I can see that." Silence settled again. The station clock clicked above them. Somewhere down the street, a blacksmith's hammer rang against steel. Finally, Caleb asked one question. "Can you teach children?" Ivy blinked. "Yes." "Reading?" "Yes." "Writing?" "Yes." "Arithmetic?" "I taught all three." He nodded once. "My two children need someone who knows how to listen more than someone who knows how to cook." She stared at him, unsure she had heard correctly. "I don't understand." "I've got room." He lifted one of the supply crates into the wagon. "If you're willing to work." Ivy glanced toward the empty road where the other family had disappeared. "You don't know anything about me." Caleb secured the crate with a length of rope. "I know enough." "You do?" "I know someone left you standing here." He looked toward Broken Pine Ranch Road, stretching west into the hills. "And I don't leave people behind if I've got room." No speech, no promises, just simple words spoken like facts. Ben smiled as though the decision had already been made hours ago. Nora, who had remained quiet beside the wagon, studied Ivy without speaking. Not welcoming, not rejecting, only watching. Ivy looked down at her old suitcase. Inside were 3 dresses, 2 books, a Bible, and every possession she still owned. She closed her hand around the worn handle. "I'll earn my keep." Caleb gave a small nod. "I expect you will." He picked up the suitcase before she could protest and placed it carefully into the wagon beside the sacks of flour. Ben climbed onto the seat with excitement. Nora settled beside him. Caleb offered Ivy the remaining place. As the wagon rolled away from Ash Creek Depot, the station slowly disappeared behind a curtain of drifting dust. Ivy turned once for a final look. She thought she was leaving behind nothing more than an embarrassing afternoon. She had no way of knowing the quiet cowboy holding the reins was driving straight toward a struggle that had been growing around Broken Pine Ranch for years. Nor did she know that before winter ended, both of their lives would depend on a handful of forgotten papers, a stubborn promise, and the simple kindness that began beside a lonely depot bench. The wagon followed a narrow dirt road that wound through golden grass and scattered pine. Evening settled over Pine Hollow Valley, softening the sharp edges of the hills. Every few miles, Caleb tipped his hat to another rider. Some waved back. Others looked past Ivy without a word. Ben never seemed to notice. He pointed toward a herd grazing near a split-rail fence. "Those are ours." Caleb smiled faintly. "They are if they stay inside the fence." Ben laughed. "They always do." Nora looked out toward the mountains. "They didn't last spring." The wagon grew quiet again. As the sun slipped lower, Broken Pine Ranch came into view. The ranch house stood on a gentle rise above Coldwater Creek. Smoke drifted from the stone chimney. A red barn leaned slightly with age, and 2 saddle horses waited patiently near the hitching rail. Beyond them stretched open pasture bordered by weathered fences that had clearly been repaired more than once. Caleb climbed down first. "I'll stable the team." Ben hurried toward the porch with a sack of coffee nearly as large as himself. "I can carry it." "You can try," Caleb answered. Ivy reached for her suitcase, but Caleb had already lifted it from the wagon. "Your room's inside." She followed him through the front door. The house smelled faintly of cedar, coffee, and wood smoke. Nothing fancy, just clean. The front room held the worn leather chair, a stone fireplace, and shelves lined with well-used books. A clock ticked steadily above the mantel. Caleb opened a small bedroom near the kitchen. It belonged to my wife's sister when she'd visit. The room held a narrow bed covered with a handmade quilt, a washstand, and a single window overlooking the corral. "It's more than enough," Ivy said quietly. "I figured you'd want a place to unpack before supper." He set her suitcase beside the bed. "I'll leave you to it." The door closed gently behind him. Ivy rested both hands on the suitcase. For the first time since leaving Kansas, she allowed herself to breathe, only for a moment. At supper, conversation came in small pieces. Ben talked enough for everyone. He explained how one calf had escaped twice in the same morning. He proudly demonstrated how he could whistle through 2 fingers, though he failed both attempts. Nora listened while pushing potatoes across her plate. Every so often she glanced toward Ivy, not unfriendly, just uncertain. Caleb poured coffee into a heavy stone mug after the meal. "You'll meet Mrs. Turner tomorrow." "The storekeeper?" "The whole valley goes through her store eventually." He looked toward the window. "So do most of the stories." The next morning dawned cold enough for frost to cling to the grass. Ivy found Ben already waiting at the kitchen table with a slate and a stub of chalk. "Pa said lessons start today. You seem excited." "I've never had a real teacher," she smiled. "Then we'll both have our first day." Their classroom became the kitchen. The table still smelled faintly of fresh bread. Morning light spilled across the pages of an old reader Caleb had found years before. Ben stumbled over long words but never gave up. By noon, he had written his own name 3 times, each one straighter than the last. From this hallway, Nora watched without entering. When Ivy noticed her, she simply pulled another chair away from the table. She said nothing. Nora said nothing. But the chair remained there all afternoon. Later that week, Ivy wandered into the storage room, searching for extra lamp oil. Instead, she found shelves filled with wooden boxes coated in years of dust. Curiosity led her closer. Inside lay folded maps, feed receipts, tax notices, freight invoices from Virginia City, and bundles of letters tied neatly with faded blue ribbon. Everything had once been organized. Now it rested forgotten beneath dust and cobwebs. She carried several stacks into better light. The dates stretched back nearly 20 years. Some pages bore Caleb's father's signature. Others listed surveys near Coldwater Creek. She carefully brushed the dirt away and began arranging them by year. No one had asked her to. It simply seemed worth doing. That Saturday, Caleb took the children into Pine Hollow for supplies. Ivy accompanied them. Mrs. Abigail Turner welcomed them with warm biscuits cooling beside the counter. "So you're the new teacher?" "I hope to be." "You'll do just fine." She wrapped flour and sugar into brown paper sacks before leaning closer. "Don't pay much attention to gossip around here." "I wasn't planning to." "Good." Abigail smiled knowingly. "Because this valley has plenty." Outside the store, a polished black wagon stopped across the street. A well-dressed man stepped down, dusting his coat as though the valley itself offended him. Victor Langford. He greeted several ranchers with practiced charm. "I've been making generous offers," he said loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Water will decide which ranches survive the next few years." One rancher shook his head. "I'm staying." Victor smiled without warmth. "Everyone has a price eventually." His eyes drifted toward Caleb. Neither man spoke. Neither looked away first. The silence between them carried years that Ivy could not yet understand. On the ride home, Caleb said little. The leather reins creaked softly in his hands. Only once did he break the silence. "If anyone asks about selling this ranch, I'll tell them it isn't my place to answer." He nodded. "Fair enough." That night, a hard wind swept across Broken Pine Ranch. It rattled windows and pushed dry leaves against the porch. Near midnight, a horse whinnied sharply. Caleb was outside before Ivy had finished pulling on her boots. Lantern lights swung across the yard. Ben watched from an upstairs window. Nora stood silently beside him. The north pasture gate hung open. Several fence rails lay broken on the ground. In the moonlight, dark shapes moved across the prairie. The cattle were gone. By sunrise, neighbors had helped gather most of the herd. Not all. One older ranch hand removed his hat. Bad luck follows change. Another quietly looked toward the ranch house before saying nothing at all. The words spread through Pine Hollow faster than the morning wind. By afternoon, people were repeating the same story. The woman who arrived from Kansas had barely unpacked her suitcase, and trouble had already found Broken Pine Ranch. By the following week, the mornings felt colder. Thin frost settled over the pasture before sunrise, only to disappear beneath the first touch of light. The ranch hands spoke less than usual. Two of them never came back after delivering their final wages receipt to Caleb. They found work farther south, one neighbor explained. Caleb looked toward the empty bunkhouse. They found easier work. He said nothing more. The silence around the ranch seemed to grow with each passing day. Ivy continued teaching Ben every morning. The little kitchen table became a classroom again. Chalk dust collected beside the coffee pot. Ben proudly read short passages aloud, while Ivy corrected only what truly mattered. Nora no longer watched from the hallway. One afternoon, she quietly sat in the empty chair that had waited beside the table all week. She opened a reader without asking permission. Ivy simply turned another page. Neither of them mentioned it. Outside, Caleb repaired fence posts damaged during the night the cattle escaped. He stopped once to tighten a loose horseshoe. Twice he looked toward the northern pasture. 3 times he counted the herd. Each time his jaw grew tighter. Late Saturday afternoon, Abigail Turner arrived with fresh bread wrapped inside a flour sack. "I baked too much again," she said. Ben grinned. "You always do." "I always pretend I do." She left the bread on the kitchen counter before lowering her voice. "Victor Langford's been visiting nearly every ranch between here and Elk River Crossing." Caleb poured coffee into 3 stone mugs. "Buying? Trying. And some folks are listening." Caleb stared into his cup for several seconds. "That creek means more than they realize." Abigail nodded. "I know." Before leaving, she placed a folded newspaper beside Ivy. "Thought you might like something to read." It was a small kindness, one Ivy would remember. A few evenings later, the smell reached them before the smoke. Ben looked up first. "Something's burning." Caleb was already outside. Far beyond the eastern pasture, above Timber Ridge, a dark column climbed into the evening sky. Not lightning, fire. He ran toward the barn. "Water barrels!" The ranch bell rang across the valley. Neighbors heard it. Within minutes, riders appeared from every direction carrying shovels, wet blankets, and axes. The storage shed beside the hay barn had caught first. Dry autumn grass spread the flames across the hillside with frightening speed. The air filled with sparks. Ash drifted like black snow. Caleb and 2 ranch hands pulled frightened horses from the stable while others formed a bucket line from the stock tank. Ivy wrapped a damp cloth around her mouth and carried water until her arms trembled. No one asked her to. She simply joined the line. Nora stayed beside Ben near the wagon, covering his face whenever smoke rolled downhill. Hours passed. The fire finally surrendered long after darkness covered Timber Ridge. Half the winter hay was gone. Several fence lines had burned flat. The barn still stood. Barely. Caleb leaned both hands against the blackened wall, breathing hard. Marshal Grant Holloway arrived just before midnight. He walked the edge of the burned ground carrying a lantern. After several minutes, he crouched beside the dirt road. "What is it?" Caleb asked. Grant lifted the light. Fresh wagon tracks, deep, wide. "They weren't made by your wagon." He followed them several yards before they disappeared into rocky ground. "They came here." His eyes narrowed, and they left in a hurry. No one spoke. There was no proof, only questions. The following morning, Ivy helped clear burned timber from the storage shed. A cracked support beam collapsed with a dull thud. Behind it lay a narrow wooden chest covered in soot. She brushed away the ashes and opened it carefully. Inside rested old ledgers, folded survey papers, and a leather-bound notebook darkened with age. The first page carried a familiar name, Samuel Sutton, Caleb's father. She carefully turned another page. Every line had been written in neat, steady handwriting. Dates, measurements, creek levels, fence locations, landmarkers. She closed this notebook gently. It deserved clean hands and careful reading. When Caleb returned from checking the pasture, Ivy held it toward him. "I think this belonged to your father." For the first time since she had arrived at Broken Pine Ranch, surprise crossed his face. "I haven't seen that book since I was a boy." Before either of them could open it, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the yard. A rider stopped beside the porch. His horse carried the dust of a long ride from Virginia City. "You Caleb Sutton?" "I am." The man handed over an official envelope sealed with dark blue wax. "Delivery from the land office." Caleb thanked him. The rider turned and disappeared back down the trail. Only the wind remained. Caleb broke the seal slowly. His eyes moved across the page, then stopped. Ivy watched him fold the letter with careful hands. "What is it?" He handed her the notice. She read the first line only once. Victor Langford had filed a formal claim challenging Broken Pine Ranch's legal right to draw water from Coldwater Creek. A hearing had been scheduled. Without that water, the cattle would never survive the coming winter. Caleb looked toward the blackened hillside, where smoke still drifted from the ashes. The fire had not been the end of their troubles. It had only been the beginning. October gave way to November, and every trip into town seemed to return with more questions than answers. Before sunrise, Caleb saddled his bay gelding and rode toward Virginia City with attorney Henry Collins. They carried the weathered notebook wrapped in canvas, along with tax receipts and folded land records that had survived the fire. "I'll be back before dark if the roads stay clear," Caleb told the children. Ben nodded. Nora only watched him tighten the saddle strap. When Caleb looked toward Ivy, he hesitated for a heartbeat. "The study is unlocked." She understood what he meant. Keep looking. After the wagon disappeared beyond the cottonwoods, Broken Pine Ranch settled into a different kind of quiet. The children finished their lessons before noon. Ben practiced his handwriting, while Nora copied a page from an old history book without being asked. When the lessons ended, Ivy carried the leather notebook into the front room and placed it beside the window where the light was strongest. The pages smelled faintly of smoke. Some corners had been darkened by the fire, but the writing remained surprisingly clear. Samuel Sutton had recorded almost everything: rainfall, fence repairs, calving seasons, freight costs. Even the dates neighbors helped repair bridges after spring floods. Page after page revealed a man who believed nothing important should be left to memory alone. Several entries mentioned Coldwater Creek. Others referred to survey crews working near Elk River Crossing nearly 20 years earlier. One note caught Ivy's attention. Stone marker set east of the Cottonwood Bend, measured with County Surveyor Elias Brooks. She read it twice, then a third time. There was no map beside the note, only a small sketch of a creek and 3 uneven circles that looked like boulders. She copied the page carefully onto fresh paper. That afternoon, Abigail Turner stopped by with a basket of apples. "I heard Caleb went to see Henry." "He did." Abigail looked toward the notebook. "Finding anything useful?" "I'm not sure yet." The older woman smiled gently. "Sometimes the important things don't look important until someone patient finds them." After she left, Ivy continued reading until the fading daylight forced her to light an oil lamp. Outside, the wind carried dry leaves across the porch. Inside, the ticking clock seemed louder than usual. Near sunset, hoofbeats echoed from the lane. Marshal Grant Holloway stepped down from his horse. "I stopped by Elk River Crossing this afternoon." He removed his gloves slowly. "There are fresh shovel marks near the old survey ground." Ivy looked up. "Someone was digging?" Grant nodded. "They weren't planting trees." He studied the copied sketch lying beside the notebook. "What are you working on?" She showed him the page. Grant leaned closer. "I've seen that name before." "Elias Brooks? The county surveyor." He tapped the paper. "Yeah. If that stone marker still exists, it could matter." Silence filled the room. Then Grant added quietly, "If someone else is looking for it first, that matters too." When Caleb returned well after dark, dust covered both his coat and boots. Henry Collins had confirmed the hearing date. 3 weeks. No more. No less. Caleb listened while Ivy explained what she had found. He read the copied page without interrupting. Finally, he folded it and slipped it inside the notebook. "You've done more in 3 weeks than I managed in 3 years." She lowered her eyes. "I only organized what was already here." "No." He looked toward the shelves where the remaining boxes still waited. "You noticed what everyone else walked past." His words stayed with her long after supper. The next morning, rumors reached the ranch before breakfast. Victor Langford's men had been seen riding near Elk River Crossing again. One rancher claimed they were measuring land. Another swore they had broken apart old stones along the creek bank. No one knew which story was true. Every version sounded possible. The days grew shorter, the air sharper. Caleb rode out before dawn and returned after sunset, trying to keep the ranch running while preparing for court. The strain showed in the lines around his eyes, though he never complained. One evening, Ivy found his coffee untouched beside the fireplace, gone cold hours earlier. She quietly poured a fresh cup. He accepted it with a tired nod. Neither spoke. Nothing more needed saying. Late that night, after the children were asleep, Ivy stood alone in her room. Her suitcase rested beneath the window exactly where Caleb had placed it on the day they arrived. She pulled it onto the bed. 1 dress, 2 books, the folded letter from Kansas. She packed slowly. Every shirt she folded felt heavier than the last. If she had never come, perhaps the gossip would never have started. Perhaps Victor would have looked elsewhere. Perhaps Caleb would have had fewer burdens. She closed the suitcase. Just before dawn, she carried it to the front porch. The leather handle felt cold in her hand. She was still standing beside it when the front door opened behind her. Caleb stepped outside, already dressed for another ride to Virginia City. His eyes moved from the suitcase to Ivy. He asked no questions. He reached into his coat pocket and placed a small iron key in her palm. It was worn smooth with years of use. "The front door," he said quietly. She looked at him, confused. He closed her fingers around the key. "If you're still holding this when I come home." He paused, his voice steady as the morning air. "I'll know you haven't given up on this place." He walked to his horse before she could answer. The gate closed behind him with a soft wooden thud. Ivy remained on the porch, the key resting in one hand, and the packed suitcase waiting silently beside the door. The morning air carried the scent of frost and pine. Caleb's horse disappeared beyond the cottonwoods, leaving only the soft rhythm of hoofbeats fading into the valley. Ivy looked down at the old iron key. It was warm from Caleb's hand. She slipped it into her coat pocket. The suitcase stayed where it was. Inside the house, Ben was already awake. He rubbed his eyes and looked toward the front porch. "Are you leaving?" She forced a small smile. "I haven't decided yet." He walked over and leaned against her arm. "I hope you stay." Children rarely searched for perfect words. They simply spoke the truth. That morning, Ivy unpacked the suitcase again. The dresses returned to the wardrobe. The books went back onto the small shelf beside the bed. Only the letter from Kansas remained inside. She folded it one last time and placed it beneath the bottom lining of the case before sliding the suitcase beneath the bed. Outside, another cold wind swept across Broken Pine Ranch. Work did not wait for court dates. The cattle still needed feeding. The fences still needed mending. Ben practiced his reading, while Nora quietly copied arithmetic problems across her slate. Halfway through the lesson, Nora stopped writing. "I heard Mrs. Cooper in town." Ivy looked up. "What did she say?" "She said people think we're going to lose the ranch." A long silence followed. Finally, Nora added, "I don't believe everything people say." It was the first time she had offered Ivy anything that sounded like trust. Late that afternoon, Marshal Grant Holloway rode into the yard. His horse was streaked with mud from Elk River Crossing. "I found it," he said before climbing down. "The marker?" Grant nodded. "Or what's left of it." He removed a cloth bundle from his saddlebag. Inside lay a broken piece of weathered stone. One side carried faint survey markings. The other had been freshly chipped. Someone tried to break it apart. Ivy carefully compared the markings to Samuel Sutton's notebook. The lines matched the old sketch almost perfectly. Grant let out a slow breath. "I'd say somebody knew exactly what they were looking for." By dusk, Caleb returned from Virginia City with attorney Henry Collins beside him. Henry spread maps across the dining table while coffee warmed over the stove. Samuel Sutton's notebook rested beside the broken stone marker. The old lawyer adjusted his spectacles. "This notebook establishes years of continuous use." He tapped the stone gently. "And this confirms where the original survey line stood." Caleb looked toward Ivy. "If you hadn't read those pages—" Henry finished the sentence for him. "We never would have known where to look." No one spoke for several moments. The crackling fire filled the room instead. Outside, snowflakes drifted through the darkness for the first time that season. The hearing took place 3 days later inside the Virginia City Land Office. Ranchers filled the wooden benches before sunrise. Victor Langford arrived wearing a fine black coat and polished boots. He smiled confidently as though the outcome had already been decided. Henry Collins presented the notebook first, then the freight receipts, then decades of tax records. Finally, Grant placed the broken stone marker on the judge's table. The room grew quiet. Henry pointed to Samuel Sutton's handwritten measurements. Grant described where the marker had been found. Victor insisted the stone proved nothing. Then Henry unfolded one final county survey copied years earlier. Its measurements matched Samuel Sutton's notebook exactly. The judge studied each page in silence. When he finally spoke, every chair in the room seemed to stop creaking. "The evidence supports the Sutton boundary." He looked toward Victor. "The claim against Broken Pine Ranch is dismissed." A murmur rolled through the courtroom. Victor lowered his eyes for the first time. His plan to control Coldwater Creek had failed. By sunset, the wagon carrying Caleb, Ivy, Henry, and Grant rolled back through the front gate. Nora stepped onto the porch before the horses had fully stopped. Without saying a word, she disappeared inside. Moments later, she returned carrying Ivy's old suitcase. She smiled shyly. "I thought this belongs upstairs." Ben hurried after her holding a freshly painted wooden board. The white letters were uneven, a little crooked, but easy to read. "Welcome home." He held it up proudly. "Can we hang it here?" Caleb looked at Ivy before answering. "If she thinks this is home." Ivy's eyes filled, but she simply nodded. Together they nailed the sign beside the front door. Spring arrived slowly across Pine Hollow Valley. Snow melted into Coldwater Creek. Fresh grass covered the hills where blackened ground had once remained after the fire. Several months later, the The bell at Pine Hollow Church rang beneath a clear blue sky. Neighbors gathered quietly. Abigail Turner straightened Ivy's simple cream-colored dress. Ben carefully carried the wedding rings inside a small wooden box. Nora stood beside Ivy, gently smoothing a wrinkle from her sleeve before taking her hand. Caleb waited near the altar with the same calm expression he had worn the day they first met at Ash Creek Depot. Only his eyes were different now. After the ceremony, children laughed beneath the cottonwood trees, while neighbors shared pies, coffee, and fresh bread on long wooden tables. By summer, the front room of Broken Pine Ranch had become a small schoolhouse each weekday morning. Slates covered the tables, books filled the shelves, young voices echoed through the windows. One evening, Caleb and Ivy stood together beside the pasture fence, watching Ben and Nora race across the tall grass. Neither hurried to speak. The valley itself seemed to understand the silence. Months earlier, a lonely woman had been left standing beside a depot with nowhere to go. Now she watched the sunset beside the family who had chosen her, and the home she had quietly chosen in return. Maybe that's why this story lingers long after the last light fades over the valley. It isn't really about a ranch, a courtroom, or an old survey marker. It's about a single moment when someone looked at another human being and chose kindness instead of turning away. Imagine standing where Ivy once stood, holding everything you own in one worn suitcase, wondering if the next goodbye will be the one that finally breaks your spirit. Then imagine one quiet act of grace changing the direction of your life, not with grand promises, but with a door left open and a place waiting at the table. Most of us will never ride across Montana on horseback, but sooner or later, we'll all face a moment when we can either close a gate or leave it open for someone who needs hope. And sometimes, the family we treasure most isn't the one we're born into. It's the one built day by day through trust, patience, forgiveness, and the courage to stay when walking away would be easier. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to know what touched your heart the most. Share your thoughts in the comments. Someone reading them may need those words today. And if these stories of quiet courage, enduring love, and second chances feel like a place you'd like to return to, I hope you'll join us again. There are many more journeys waiting just beyond the next trail, each carrying another reminder that hope often arrives in the most unexpected way.